Thank you guys for being here and being present for this talk on emotional neglect, which I call the silent relationship killer. Have you ever faked a smile when someone asked you how you were doing, yet inside you were feeling empty after a fight with your spouse? We all bear the wounds of relationship battles. We are all wounded warriors in this journey called life. We all experience emotional brokenness and are in need of a healing balm, a tender touch, and warm embrace. Unfortunately, emotions are not well understood, making it difficult to both share and care for relational injuries. The purpose of this presentation is to explore the intricacies of our emotional experiences and how they, in fact, regulate the health of close relationships. In particular, we will highlight and explore the pervasive yet silent lifelong effects of childhood emotional neglect from a ministry perspective. In order to confront this heartbreaking experience, it is imperative to begin with an understanding of how God has created us for relational connection. God's very nature is relational, as seen most intimately in the unity of the Trinity. The biblical narrative clearly outlines how God created us as relational beings with the need to be attached to others through strong, nurturing, and loving connections. Within these most important relationships, there should be a sense of security expressed as, I can count on you. You really care about me. I am worthy of your love and protection. In addition, God created human beings with a longing to be known, understood, and valued by both God and others. The essence of relationship is at the heart of who God is, both declaring and describing our most fundamental need. God is the ultimate attachment figure. He is always near to us, wants us to enjoy his presence. He wants us to feel his embrace and to feel secure in our relationship with him. We seek a close, bonded relationship with him in times of peace and in times of trouble, enabling us to face a sometimes dangerous world with confidence. In fact, God communicates the importance of relationships in his great commandment seen in Matthew 22:37 through 40. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This commandment illuminates the significance of connecting to God and others. Relational connection is at the core of the good news of the gospel. It is what we need the most, what we lack the most, and what we fear the most. The longing to connect defines our destiny as image bearers, created by a connected triune God. As bearers of God's image, we are designed to connect and live in relationships with others. While God is our principal attachment figure, our very survival depends on attaching to important others within the context of families and communities. Our need for connection cannot be understood apart from the dynamics of emotions, which serve as a type of relational GPS, sounding the alarm when we swerve off course, becoming lost and disconnected from the people we love the most. Our emotional GPS shows us we are okay, on the right path, relationally speaking. Our emotions keep us in tune with what is going on around us with regard to verbal and nonverbal interactions with others, letting us know how to proceed forward in a relationship. For believers, the Holy Spirit is intricately involved in emotionally guiding our relationships as comforter, advocate, and intercessor. However, relational patterns established during childhood tend to be the driving force that determine how we respond emotionally. In particular, the expression of negative emotions such as doubt, anger, anxiety, and fear are adaptive survival strategies established within our childhood families. What we know about emotions is learned through our life experiences in familial, social, and culture practices. For example, as children develop and mature, they learn what emotions and accompanying actions are suitable in various contexts. Children learn which emotions are safe and appropriate to express, and at the same time, which emotions should be avoided or disavowed. For example, American society tolerates female children expressing vulnerable emotions such as fear and sadness, while males are generally encouraged and allowed to express anger. Within Christian circles, some would argue that all negative expressions of emotions are simply a reflection of our sin nature. This view tends to stigmatize some emotions as negative because of the belief that they cause people to act out of control in unbecoming and ungodly ways. To better understand the nature of emotions, consider a baby's cry. All would agree it is a natural response to emotional and physical needs such as hunger, being alone in the dark, and having soiled diapers. A loving parent understands crying as a God-given way for children to respond to distress. No one would consider a baby's cry as a form of manipulation delivered out of a heart of sin. On the contrary, emotions serve an important protective purpose within relationships. In fact, strong emotions can be seen in the same light as an elevated body temperature. It is well known that an elevated temperature plays an integral role in the body's healing process. A fever is part of the immune response to fight infection. In the same way, distressing emotions are part of the limbic system to alert us that we are feeling danger. Therefore, we can consider overwhelming emotions such as anger, anxiety, or depression not as something to be medicated or controlled, but rather as indicators that important needs are being neglected. Furthermore, giving proper attention to, rather than avoiding escalated emotions, is necessary. It becomes extremely important to tune into what our emotions are telling us before we respond to them. Recognizing that distressing or negative emotions are not bad in and of themselves. Of course, how we respond in the midst of feeling overwhelmed is critical. The significance of emotional experiences in childhood has been broadly studied. Researchers provide evidence that early childhood relationships that lack a loving and caring response can lead to depression and anxiety. For example, parental anger, disciplinary inconsistency, the withholding of love by caregivers, and other types of emotional abuse and neglect are all given as risk factors associated with childhood mental disorders. Leading developmental theorists recognize that the etiology of depression and anxiety is directly related to the quality of the parent-child relationship. There is a pervasive but mistaken impression that children are immune to the effects of emotional abuse and neglect because they are inherently resilient and grow out of emotional difficulties. These findings help explain the alarming prevalence of depression in the United States and the insane number of antidepressants dispensed each year to both children and adults. According to the CDC, antidepressants are the third most commonly prescribed drug taken by Americans of all ages. Childhood emotional abuse and neglect can be defined broadly as the omission and commission of persistent, non-physical, harmful interactions with the child by the caregiver. Within this definition, there resides substantial overlap between the varying forms of emotional abuse and neglect. Both involve a sustained pattern of maladaptive interactions between caregiver and child, such as frequent yelling, threatening to leave, name-calling, and belittling remarks such as "you're stupid" or "you'll never amount to anything." In particular, emotional neglect entails a chronic rejection of another's emotional and psychological needs. When these needs are not acknowledged or addressed, a child will inevitably feel ignored, dismissed, and invisible. The unspoken message that emotional disregard sends to the child is, "Your feelings don't matter to me." Eventually, the child internalizes the message and accepts that her emotions shouldn't matter to her. Ultimately, the message saturates the soul of the child and is at times translated into, "You don't matter to me." To illustrate the effects of emotional neglect in early childhood, Dr. Ed Tronick videotaped a powerful parent-child scenario known as the Steele face experiment. In the video, a mother smiles, coos, and plays with her infant daughter. The baby smiles and responds to the positive interaction. Then the mother is instructed to turn away from the child for a brief moment. When she looks back at her daughter, she shows no emotion on her face and doesn't interact with the child in any way. At first, the baby tries to maintain the positive interaction that they had before, but quickly recognizes that something is amiss. She points in the direction of an object to get a response from mom, but gets in return an empty stare. The baby cries out to the mother in a loud squeal, and still there is nothing, no emotional response. Within a matter of minutes, the infant succumbs to her emotional despair by crying. She loses control of her body in response to the emotional void in mom's face, which says, "I have left you." Crying is the clear response to the fear and sadness of separation. Children experiencing a disregard of their emotional distress, apart from crying, have limited means of reconnecting to their significant other. With no one to help them find the words to convey their emotional pain, they find themselves acting out in ways they don't even understand. Of course, when their acting out is interpreted as misbehavior, parents will apply correction and discipline. So children incorrectly interpret their emotional distress and helplessness as illegitimate. The painful reality is that acting out is a child's only means of expressing the pain within. The lack of validation and acknowledgement of the child's emotional pain by the parent results in a cycle of emotional neglect that continues into adulthood. Consider the following example of the cycle of emotional neglect. Jack is 6 years old. When a new babysitter arrives to care for him and his baby sister, he starts jumping up and down on the sofa. His mom is annoyed that he's jumping on the sofa and tells him to stop. Jack stops for a brief moment, and when Mom redirects her attention back toward the babysitter, Jack continues his sofa gymnastics. Mom notices and turns back toward Jack, responding angrily out of embarrassment, and screams at Jack to sit down. She threatens to take away her son's iPod Touch if he doesn't stop immediately. Then she grabs his arm and pulls him off the sofa. Mom and Dad leave for their date, and on the way out, remind Jack that he better be good while they are gone or else. Let's look at this all too common scenario from Jack's point of view. He's anxious as a new babysitter arrives, indicating that Mom and Dad will leave. Will the new babysitter be kind? And what if she isn't? How long will Mom and Dad be gone? Jack thinks, what happens if I miss them and I get scared? Jack already has that sinking feeling of dread and a sick feeling of being left alone. Jack gets triggered by the fear of being left alone with a stranger again. Then Jack remembers, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be a big boy and not be afraid. All of this emotional chaos comes up in a matter of moments, but since Jack doesn't have the words to describe his experience, he expresses his fear by jumping up and down on the sofa. The fear worsens as Mom gets agitated and yells at him. Now Jack feels like a bad boy. His emotional reaction backfires, and his greatest fears are realized. Jack's expressions of his fear results in threats of punishment, so he shuts down his emotions. Mom makes it clear that he cannot express his fear when she leaves him alone. Unfortunately, Mom doesn't know that what Jack is trying to communicate, because she's dealing with her own emotions of shame and embarrassment at not being able to control her child. The results? Both Mom and Jack completely misunderstand what the other is trying to communicate. Mom and Dad leave, and Jack is left with a sitter who is little more than a stranger to him and his familiar feelings of abandonment. Jack is also left with a clear sign that he has to cope with his fears as best as he can, all by himself. The cycle we see in Mom and Jack's story is a common and subtle example of the cycle of emotional neglect that represent parent-child interactions that go mostly unnoticed in our families and societies. In this cycle, common parental responses to what they perceive as bad behavior include telling the child to stop, slapping the child's hand, face, or bottom, the parent raising her voice or muttering under her breath, calling the child an offensive name, putting the child in time out, sending the child to his room, and threatening the child. Other examples include putting the child down with a comment such as, "You'll never amount to anything," and telling the child that he's going to get punished when Daddy gets home. In return, it is normal for children to protest against their parents' attempts to correct their behavior. Paradoxically, being corrected or disciplined is a threat to the parent-child relationship, signifying a rupture in their connection. Immediate reactions to the disconnection include the child starting to cry, yelling back at a parent, refusing to stay in timeout, slapping or hitting the parent, turning away from the parent, all in response to the emotional pain of being separated from them. Once a parent or child is triggered emotionally, distressed feelings such as anger, sadness, and fear will emerge and require some sort of response. In the example of Jack and his mom, Jack's feelings of anxiety, demonstrated as jumping on the sofa, evoked a feeling of embarrassment from his mother, which escalated Jack's anxiety into fear, which escalated mom's embarrassment into shame and anger, which led to Jack feeling rejected and abandoned. Jack is left to cope with all of his despair alone, without words or an opportunity to know how to repair his relationship, as the most important people on earth leave him with a stranger. This is important to understand because these types of back and forth interactions are learned and in large part determined by how the parent was raised growing up. Lacking knowledge of the cycle of emotional neglect guarantees a continuation of a family culture that shuts down the expression of emotional despair in children. As children grow up, they learn how to hide or ignore their feelings, knowing that acting out of their emotional distress is dangerous, potentially leading to separation and relational abandonment. This cycle of emotional neglect that begins in childhood does not automatically reset to normal as maturation occurs. The manner in which children learn to regulate their moods and emotional responses persist into adulthood. Adults experience their childhood emotional neglect as both the desire for connection and the fear of connection. As a result, they will deny their real feelings and rationalize their behavior in relationships with others. For example, they will minimize their pain by telling themselves that they shouldn't get so upset about small relationship ruptures. Not only that, when emotionally disconnected, they tend to minimize the effects that they have on others, intimating that others should get a grip on themselves and calm down. Fast forward 20 years, and the emotionally neglected child becomes the emotionally neglected and insensitive adult. The goal of studying emotional neglect is not to blame uninformed parents, but rather to develop an understanding of how our parents have affected us and how, in turn, we have affected our children. We don't want our children to suffer the same emotional deprivation we experienced. This insight has been labeled the intergenerational transmission of insecurity. Recognizing the effects of disconnection demands a proactive stance that involves breaking the intergenerational cycle for current and subsequent generations. Breaking the pattern of emotional neglect requires a corrective emotional experience. People need support, encouragement, and permission to share their vulnerability. To do this, they need to experience safe relationships where sharing deep pain is accepted and normalized. The following story provides a real-life example of how connecting interactions can repair the cycle of emotional neglect. Bella was 4 years old when her family moved to another country. She was a happy, outgoing kid who never met a stranger. She was taken to the local preschool where her parents enrolled her. During this brief visit, she met her new teachers and toured the school. Bella seemed excitedly nervous about the possibility of going to preschool and playing with all the other kids. So, the next day, her parents dropped her off at her classroom and then left to go to language school. In the middle of the afternoon, Bella's parents get a phone call and are confused when the person on the other side of the line was saying something like, "Bea, Bea, Bea." Finally, the school official put a hysterical Bella on the phone. Her parents attempted to reassure her, telling her they were on the way to pick her up. When they arrived, Bella was in the office, still crying uncontrollably. Her mother picked her up and hugged her. Bella calmed down quickly. Her parents took her home. When they talked to Bella afterwards, she said she got scared when the teacher who spoke English left and she couldn't talk to anyone because no one else spoke English. She began to cry, and no one could understand what was wrong with her. She was scared and just wanted to be with her parents. The next day, her mother took Bella to the school with a plan. As she walked into the classroom, her mother told her that she was going to sit outside the classroom door, and if she got scared, she could look out the door to make sure that Mom was still there. Every few minutes, Bella came to check on her mother's presence, and then poked her head out about every 15 minutes. After some time, Bella gave her mother permission to leave until school was over. The next day, the same thing happened, except Bella told her mother she could leave after about an hour. The following day, Mom needed to stay just a few minutes. Bella eventually learned the local language and was almost fluent within a few months. She loved her preschool and made many friends. This story demonstrates the importance of connecting interactions which serve to develop emotional attunement between Bella and her parents. Because they anticipated and understood Bella's emotional fears, their intervention normalized her emotional response. Instead of trying to correct her emotional outbreak, crying, they validated her emotional experience, letting her know they would always be there for her. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. As we have seen repeated in the emotional neglect cycle, adults tend to default to their learned emotional responses that are triggered from the past. The phenomena of being triggered is a normal, automatic response that we all experience from time to time. When our relationships are threatened, deep fears of rejection and abandonment surface. We try to hide these overwhelming emotions because we are ashamed of them. Shame is an all-encompassing emotion that moves us to both highlight our good traits and cover up the undesirable parts of ourselves. Like Jack's mom, we are ashamed of the actions of our unruly children and will work hard to correct their behavior, even at the risk of misunderstanding the driving and painful emotions behind their behavior. Based on childhood experiences, we learn to hide our vulnerable emotions, such as fear and sadness, terrified that others will see us as weak and needy. Like Adam and Eve, who tried to hide their nakedness from God, we try to hide our personal imperfections from others, which include our emotional vulnerabilities. Consider, for example, Nathan. Nathan, like Bella, had connecting parents who understood the effects emotional neglect can have on families. Both of Nathan's parents were involved in caring professions and had each worked through many of their own emotionally neglectful childhood stories. Together, they raised Nathan to stay in touch with his emotions in positive ways. Nathan spent a year in Iraq as a U.S. soldier. During this time, he struggled with emotions no one should ever have to experience. He dealt with the sheer terror at the thought that at any moment he could die. His faith was rattled but not shattered. After his return to the States, he met Erica, who was studying to be a nurse. As a natural caregiver, she was open to listening to his emotional struggles. One Veterans Day, a challenging day for Nathan, He was emotionally triggered, overwhelmed with sadness as he remembered his buddies who were injured or died in Iraq. At the pinnacle of this difficult day, instead of asking Nathan to simply get over it or to bare his soul in a counselor's office, Erica took his arm, drew him near, and held him tight. Erica would not allow Nathan to be drawn into a convicting lie that he should be ashamed of his feelings. Her token of care took little or no verbal communication, just a clear sign that his sadness mattered and that he was safe in his relationship with her. Unlike tens of thousands of other vets who suffer alone, in shame and silence, unable to communicate their emotional struggle, on this Veterans Day, Nathan was not alone in his pain. Every culture utilizes some form of shame to govern social and interpersonal relationships. The term shame is used to describe a sense of disgrace that we feel and then try to hide from others, to escape the fear that we are deficient or inadequate in their eyes. Without realizing what we're doing, we learn to conceal our unacceptable emotional experiences from others so that we can maintain relational connection and social approval. Shame is a highly relational emotion, and outside of the need for connection with others, shame becomes unnecessary. As children feel emotions and are given the message that their expressions of feelings are unacceptable, they eventually will internalize the message as I am unacceptable. Shame is the experience of feeling unacceptable when one expresses emotional pain. That's why the inbred silence around shame makes sense. Shame prevents us from being emotionally vulnerable because we can't openly share our greatest fears with important others who in the past have criticized or ignored our emotional experience. As time goes on, we dismiss our own emotional experiences by becoming numb and hiding our pain. Thereby, shame not only alienates us from significant others who matter the most, it alienates us from ourselves. A theology of shame assumes feelings of loneliness and isolation, of silence and secrecy, of failure and shortcoming. Within the biblical narrative, there are many examples of the shame experience. The biblical account of the woman caught in adultery illuminates the silent nature of emotional neglect and the subsequent shame inherent within relationships. See John 8, 1 through 11. The narrative begins with Jesus teaching outside the temple. He's interrupted by the scribes and Pharisees who are seeking to test him, to discredit him, to bring charges against him. They bring a woman to him who's been caught in adultery, and by law, the penalty for her shameful action is death by stoning. You can only imagine that the woman is scared to death, terrified, knowing she may die that day after being emotionally and physically tortured. It is clear that the scribes and Pharisees are unconcerned with her fate, much less with her emotional despair. They are, however, very concerned with protecting their relationships with the Jewish population and with each other. They are fighting to preserve their value and worth within the Jewish community. However, the value and the worth of the woman is disregarded, dismissed, and ignored, overridden by an intense need to defend the Jewish tradition. Putting her on public display draws attention to her shame. The sexual encounters she hides are uncovered. She feels alone, exposed, rejected, and abandoned. Yet, at the height of the scribes' and Pharisees' eagerness, Jesus slows the scene down by writing on the ground with his finger. All the while, they continue to press Jesus for a response so they can trap him in their snare. Quite unexpectedly, Jesus addresses them in their secret place of shame. When he asks, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her," not willing for their shame to be exposed to public view, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. Like he does to the Pharisees and the scribes, Jesus uncovers the vulnerability hidden within all of us, not just the woman caught in adultery. He understands that we all face situations and circumstances where our emotional distress is dismissed and ignored by others, leaving us to suffer in silence. In the woman's greatest hour of need, Jesus was there for her, extending to her a loving and caring appeal to sin no more. This story clearly conveys Jesus' compassion and truthfulness, displaying his kindness, gentleness, humility, and patience with his loved one. How can the compassion of Christ compel us to extend this gift to those who are hurting? Spurgeon said, "If you would sum up the whole character of Christ in reference to ourselves, it would be gathered into this one sentence: he was moved with compassion." Spurgeon preached about compassion as expressive of a deepest emotion, connected with pity for another. Speaking of Jesus' compassion, Spurgeon taught that it was not his occasional stance, but rather a continuous mark of the substance of his character. To be moved with compassion is translated from splanchnizomai in Greek and is understood as the seat of our emotions. Compassion is felt in one's chest and stomach area, oftentimes stated as one's gut. Compassion involves an emotional response when we are moved by the struggles of others. Anne Voskamp, a well-known Christian writer, illuminates the nature of compassion. "When you listened to me and I felt heard, I felt that we were really connected. When you let my heart say everything it needed to say and you weren't afraid to hear it, I felt close to you." Something transformative happens when the wounds we don't even know we have under the surface are touched with a compassion that we can hardly even imagine. True and lasting healing from emotional neglect involves awareness and recognition of our silent cry for compassion. To be the recipient of compassion, we must open up our hearts and honestly feel and surrender our painful emotional experiences to God and others. Voskamp eloquently shares that we have two choices when it comes to responding to our emotions: the barrier way or the broken way. Quote, "You can throw up a barrier to vainly keep the hurt out. Either retreat behind self-protective barriers of escapism, defensiveness, apathy, or distraction, or choose the humility of vulnerability of letting somebody in. For all the supposed effectiveness of self-protective barriers, there isn't a barrier in the world that can block out pain." End quote. Anger or indifference are the usual ways that people attempt to alleviate the pain of emotional disconnection. This presentation is about how to stay connected and safe within relationships. Healing begins when we allow a safe person to help us embrace and accept the truth of our emotional experiences. Clearly, whatever is denied, concealed, dismissed, or minimized cannot be healed. 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 4 gives instructions to help in the healing process. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. Paul is clearly speaking about the importance of understanding the vast array of emotions we experience. As our burdens are shared during the telling and retelling of our emotional pain, it becomes more bearable for us as new meanings are constructed, allowing us to experience Jesus' compassionate presence. A comforting embrace provided through connected relationships offers us a sense of feeling wanted and emotionally supported, as opposed to feeling alone and emotionally neglected. During Jesus' earthly visit, he experienced the same hardships we know in our lives today. Jesus wept with Mary and Martha as his friend Lazarus lay in a tomb. He wept over Jerusalem. He was in great agony on the Mount of Olives prior to his arrest, torture, and death. During his life and in his death experience, we see that even though God was with Jesus in his moments of despair, he did not always remove the emotional pain. Timothy Keller insists that this is why Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We too can be secure in the knowledge that God did then and does now provide a safe refuge for the wounded soul. When you feel disconnected, abandoned, or rejected, do you turn to God for comfort or demand of him relief from your pain? Do you reach toward God to expand your experience of his presence, to hear his voice, to trust and hope in him? Pushing through your barrier, imagine turning to God and others with your pain. Imagine focusing on the relational pain of others rather than the conduct by which they express their pain. Imagine validating and acknowledging the pain within others rather than judging the behavior that reflects their pain. The art of compassion begins when we gently enter into someone else's painful battle to experience God as a fellow struggler. Like Jesus, we must listen with eagerness, willing to enter whatever doors are opened, even to a small degree, to hear what is shared without retreating. We enter with a focus of being with others, interested, compassionate, and concerned with a godly, caring perspective. The journey toward healing involves a corrective relational experience, bringing God-imbued comfort to injured and wounded souls. As feelings are processed and understood, core beliefs about relationships are revised. These revised relationship rules, focused on the need for compassion, will hopefully promote closeness and intimacy with God and others, experienced as a soft word and tender embrace. This presentation is intended to help us understand and reframe our story from a new attachment perspective. The purpose of reframing our story is to see ourselves and others in a different light. How our deepest tears are often shed alone, without someone to hear and care, leaving the wounds unhealed. We now know that when we disavow our emotions, as well as the emotions of others, we reject the sovereign design of God in our lives. Didn't God proclaim while in the garden, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Clearly, God cares for us, but also desires for us to care well for one another. As the church takes on the redemptive and compassionate work of Christ, a shift in response is needed toward those suffering from the shame of emotional neglect. A compassionate response involves a focus on the silent yet painful emotions experienced by another. An emotionally focused approach is concerned about the welfare of others with the goal of relieving the distressed person's emotional pain. Most often, individuals just need moments of quiet, patient listening, sensitive reflections, and emotional attunement in the pastoral or counselor's office. Such moments often can become worship spaces in their own right. A compassionate approach by Christian counselors and ministry leaders provides a safe place for individuals to reconcile the learned fears associated with emotional neglect. Listen to any sermon that speaks of God's love and hear it said of how God understands us. He cares about how we feel. He protects us. He provides for us and soothes our worries and fears. We are privileged as a pastor and ministry leader to join those who pour out their troubles to us and wait for a word of compassion to heal the wounds of their soul. Showing sensitivity and responsiveness to the emotional pain experienced by others creates a healing human connection. Koenig and Larson remind us that the greatest contribution of religious traditions toward human suffering is the vocation of comfort and kindness, which promote healing relationships. A compassion-informed approach does not exonerate individuals from taking responsibility for their actions. Rather, it provides a platform from which people can heal from their past emotional neglect and develop healthier relationships for the benefit of the next generation. Thank you.